In April of 2012, a team of genetic genealogists published the most comprehensive DNA study ever conducted on a community whose ancestry had been argued over, fought over, and mythologized for 200 years, in academic journals, in best-selling books, and at kitchen tables across 3 states. The community lives concentrated around a single ridge in northeastern Tennessee. In over 2 centuries, they had been called almost everything except what the DNA would eventually show them to be: Portuguese, Turkish, Romani, descendants of shipwrecked Mediterranean sailors, survivors of the lost colony of Roanoke. The name history actually gave this community was thrown at them as an insult sometime around 1810 and stuck anyway: Melungeon. In the spring of 2012, researcher Roberta Estes led a team that published their findings in the peer-reviewed Journal of Genetic Genealogy. And the answer the DNA gave was not the one nearly a century of popular theory had prepared anyone to hear. This is the real origin of the Melungeons of Newman's Ridge, and it is also the story of why a community had to build an entirely different story about itself just to survive. Newman's Ridge sits in Hancock County, Tennessee, a spine of steep, rocky, agriculturally useless terrain running along the Tennessee-Virginia line. The soil there grows corn and beans and not much else. Nobody settles land that poor by choice. Families settled it because the isolation protected them from something worse than poor soil. Beginning in the late 1700s, roughly 40 interrelated families, carrying surnames like Collins, Gibson, Goins, Bunch, and Bolton, began to appear in the tax and court records of the region, consistently listed under the vague and often shifting racial category free persons of color. That classification was not a footnote. In Virginia and Tennessee in the early 1800s, being formally recorded as anything other than white carried real legal consequences: the loss of the right to vote, the right to testify against a white person in court, the right to marry across the color line, and in some jurisdictions, the right to own land outright. For a family in that position, the difference between being recorded as Portuguese and being recorded as anything else was not a matter of pride. It was a matter of keeping your farm, your vote, and your standing in front of a judge. Virginia law had defined degrees of black ancestry by statute since the early 1700s, and Tennessee's own 1834 Constitution formally stripped free persons of color of the right to vote, a right many Melungeon families had exercised for a generation beforehand. Losing that classification fight in a courtroom did not just cost a family its dignity. It costed a vote that, once taken away, most families in this position would not get back for well over a century. Even the word Melungeon itself has never had one agreed upon origin. Some researchers trace it to the French word mélange, meaning mixed. Others connect it to a Portuguese or Angolan word, melungo, historically used to describe a sailor or shipmate. Still others have proposed a Turkish phrase, Melungeon, said to translate roughly as cursed soul, an idea that would later feed directly into one of the most influential theories about this community's origin. Whichever route is correct, and researchers still disagree, the word was already being used as an insult in the mountains of Tennessee before anyone had settled the question of where it came from, let alone where the people it described actually came from. That question found its most famous answer in 1994, when a Virginia-born academic named Brent Kennedy, who discovered in adulthood that his own family carried Melungeon ancestry, published a book called The Melungeons, The Resurrection of a Proud People. Kennedy proposed that the community descended largely from Mediterranean and Ottoman Turkish sailors, shipwrecked or abandoned along the southeastern coast in the 1500s, later intermixing with Native American and European settlers as they moved inland. The book became the defining popular account of Melungeon origins for nearly 2 decades. It reframed a heritage that had been treated as a source of shame into something to take real pride in, and it made Kennedy a prominent figure in the community he had grown up not fully understanding. He founded the Melungeon Heritage Association, led research delegations to Turkey, and helped establish his sister city relationship between his hometown of Wise, Virginia, and the Turkish coastal town of Çeşme. For a large number of families who had spent generations being told to keep quiet about who they were, being told instead that they descended from Ottoman sailors was a story worth embracing. The DNA published in 2012 traced a different, and for many of those same families, unexpected picture. On the direct paternal line, tested through the Y chromosome, the dominant signal was not Mediterranean and not Ottoman. It was a combination of sub-Saharan African and Northern or Central European origin. On the direct maternal line, tested through mitochondrial DNA, the small sample of Melungeon-descended women who were tested came back almost entirely in haplogroup H, the most common maternal lineage in Europe. Put plainly, the genetic evidence pointed to African men and European women forming unions in colonial Virginia in the late 1600s and early 1700s, generations before any of these families migrated into the mountains of Tennessee at all. Only one paternal line in the entire study, the Freeman line, carried a Native American Y chromosome marker. Lead researcher Roberta Estes said afterward that a great many people who had grown up believing their family was Portuguese, Ottoman, or Native American were upset by what the study actually showed. It did not fit the story that had, by then, given an entire generation of descendants something to be proud of instead of something to hide. Direct address for a moment to anyone watching whose family carries one of these surnames, and always told a story about Portuguese sailors or Ottoman traders or a Native American ancestor several generations back. Those stories were not lies invented for no reason. In a legal system that could strip you of your vote and your land for one racial classification and protect you for another, calling yourself Portuguese was not dishonesty. It was survival. Genealogists studying the earliest court records have found the Portuguese claim specifically, in the handwriting of court clerks recording how families identified themselves generations before the word Melungeon was ever used as an insult against them. The story was built to hold a place in the record that the truth, at that time, could not safely occupy. If you watched our earlier video on the Cherokee great-grandmother story told across greater Appalachia, you already understand the underlying instinct at work here. A family reaching for the version of its own history that the world outside would let it keep. The difference on Newman's Ridge is that the stakes were never just social. They were legal, and for close to 150 years, they were enforceable in a courtroom. Subscribe to the channel right now for a breakdown like this, one that maps DNA test results onto the actual legal and historical record instead of the folklore, is what you came here for. We do this every week. By the 1840s and 1850s, the first published newspaper accounts of the community had turned the slur into a kind of dark tourist attraction, describing the people of the ridge in the racially anxious, romanticized language typical of the era, treated as a mysterious mountain race rather than understood as what the record actually shows, a group of families adapting to an impossible legal bind with the tools available to them. The most damaging of those early published accounts came later in 1890, when a journalist named Will Allen Dromgoole traveled to Newman's Ridge and wrote a series of magazine pieces for a Nashville publication describing the community in openly contemptuous terms, work that was reprinted widely and shaped outside perception of the Melungeons for the next several generations. Dromgoole was not a neutral observer. She arrived already convinced the community was racially degraded, and her writing reflected exactly that conviction back to a national audience that had never met a single person she was describing. Not every family carries the same story underneath the same label. Genetic research on the Riddle family, closely associated with Melungeon communities through generations of intermarriage and shared geography, traced their direct paternal line to entirely European origin, a reminder that the word Melungeon eventually became a shared community identity far broader than any single genetic line running underneath it. Separately, non-genetic historical and anthropological research has identified branches of the Collins, Goins, and Gibson surnames of the Newman's Ridge community as having documented Native American connections, specifically to Saponi families, running alongside the African and European lines the 2012 DNA study traced. The full picture is not one story. It is several family histories, converging on one ridge, held together for 2 centuries by the same protective label, and Newman's Ridge is not unique. Similar communities of mixed African, European, and Native ancestry formed across the South under the same legal pressure. The Red Bones of Louisiana and South Carolina, the Brass Ankles further along the Carolina coast, the Turks of Sumter County, South Carolina. Genealogists now recognize these groups collectively as triracial isolates, separate communities that arrived at strikingly similar survival strategies independently, because they were all navigating the same laws. By the 20th century, most families of Melungeon descent were being recorded in census documents as white, marrying into the broader white population of the region, and the specific term itself faded from daily use outside the mountains, remembered mostly as regional folklore about a strange and secretive mountain people. That began to change in the 1990s, first through Kennedy's book, and then through the wave of serious genealogical research it inspired, as descendants started researching their own family trees in earnest, driven partly by the same curiosity now reaching millions of Americans through consumer DNA testing. In 1997, descendants held the first Melungeon Union, a gathering that brought together people from across the country who had grown up hearing fragments of this story from grandparents and wanted to understand where it actually came from. Annual gatherings continue today, on and around Newman's Ridge itself, the same inhospitable terrain that once offered isolation from persecution, now serving as a gathering point for descendants, publicly reclaiming a history their ancestors had strong legal reasons to obscure. If your family carries a surname like Collins, Gibson, Goins, Bunch, Bolton, Riddle, or Freeman, and your family history runs back through Hancock or Hawkins County, Tennessee, or the far southern edge of Lee, Scott, or Russell County, Virginia, there is a real possibility your family is part of this story. Your consumer DNA test will not label any of this for you. It will show percentages of African, European, and possibly Native American ancestry, broken into broad regional categories, with no note attached explaining that those percentages might trace back to a free black man and a European woman forming a household in colonial Virginia 300 years before you took the test, and to the generations of families afterward, who built first one alternate ancestry story to survive the law, and later a second, prouder one to survive the shame that law had left behind. Newman's Ridge kept those families physically isolated from the legal enforcement that would have destroyed their standing in court and at the ballot box. It could not keep their bloodlines isolated from the historical record forever. 200 years after a slur was first used to describe them, one popularized theory later gave them an origin story to be proud of, and a peer-reviewed study after that gave them a different one, grounded in colonial Virginia rather than the Ottoman coast. All three versions are now part of the same record. The families of that ridge are the ones telling it on their own terms, at last.